We'll get started and I can talk a little bit before Lynn brings up the presentation. So tonight at our November 17th subcommittee meeting, what I want to talk about is two-family housing in New Canaan. As you may recall at our last meeting, which I think was in July, we discussed senior housing options. And this may feel like a bit of a departure, but I do think there is a relationship here. My takeaway from the senior housing presentation that I gave and the research that I did is that healthy communities provide a diversity of housing types. And as you may recall from the senior housing presentation, we talked about everything ranging from being able to age in place all the way through fully, assisted living and nursing home options. But there was a lot in the middle, including accessory dwelling units, cluster housing or pocket neighborhoods, two-family, three-family, four-family dwellings. So I don't think this is too much of a departure. I actually think this is kind of a subset of what we talked about in July. I also think that it's kind of a timely conversation because we've been seeing, at least my opinion is that we have seen a fair number of these two-family dwelling requests through special permits. And I just think it's something that we might want to get ahead of, at least in our thought process, if not in our zoning regulations. So yeah, and I think at the end of conversations that we hopefully will have today and in the future about diversifying our housing stock, we'll come back to this diversified housing stock and say, okay, now what do we need to specifically do to make these units accessible to seniors, whether it's physically accessible, financially accessible, or otherwise, deed restricted. That's where I think we're headed with this. I don't think I can control the presentation, so I'll just get started and hope that Lynn can catch up with me in a minute. So there was a cover page, but that's kind of irrelevant. We've already talked about what the topic is tonight. So to start off, two-family dwellings in New Canaan are allowed by special permit only in the B residence zone and in the apartment zone. And we allow what I would call duplexes, or a single building with two units inside of it, in both zones per the standards here that I've taken straight from the zoning ordinance. But we also allow something that's a little, or frankly, a lot less common, which is having two detached single family homes on one site. And you can see that under their B residence zone, that we allow two detached dwelling units on common land. And then we carry that over to the apartment zone with just some slightly different dimensional standards, but the same concept exists there. Lynn, are you able to go to the next slide for me? We'll just pause here for a minute. This looks like the same thing, except I just wanted to point out that one thing that stood out to me, and this was a while ago, but we heard an application for two-family homes on lots next to each other on Richmond Hill. And we had Glenn Childler do a report for us on, what the implications of making some changes to our apartment zoning district were. And one of the things he pointed out, among a lot of things in that memo, is that we have conflicting standards for where the types of lots we allow two detached dwelling units on. In the B residence zone, they're on lots containing at least 15,000 square feet. And in the apartment zone, they're on lots of less than 15,000 square feet, which feels rather contradictory to me. And frankly, if we fix nothing else with the two-family dwelling regulations, I think that's an obvious conflict that we need to address. Lynn, next slide. So in terms of where we allow two-family dwellings, unfortunately, this map turned out pretty small on this PDF, but it's, as I already said, in the B residence zone and the apartment zone. And hopefully you can see here, there's a pink line outlining the generic areas of where those are. And basically it's the core of our town. It's the residential core of our town. I shouldn't say the core, because these residential areas surround our downtown business and retail zones. So, I mean, it's basically all the streets you would think of, Seminary Street, all the way up to like River Street on the east side of 123, all the way down South Avenue, and over towards Mead Park. That's generally the boundaries of that area. Lynn, next slide. Lynn, can you go to, sorry. All right, so I want to talk about the benefits of two-family dwellings. I'm a big proponent of these, and I actually think in the context of the development pattern we have in New Canaan, that these could be a really great way for us to increase density and diversify our housing stock without ultimately changing the character of what's primarily a single family neighborhood. And our neighborhoods are primarily single family. So I think the benefits are that they play an important role, especially here, in diversifying our housing stock. Just because of adding another unit, you get more density, which is a more efficient use of land and more energy efficient. They provide units that might be desired by a different demographic than those who want to live in single family homes, whether it's seniors, whether it's millennials, whether it's young couples, whether it's single parents. They can provide opportunities for affordable and senior housing in a generic sense, but if we want to make those more restrictive and more specific, that's a conversation we need to have. Probably most importantly, they work to increase the density in infill locations, but by also, I think, really fitting into the character of single family neighborhoods. And we're going to look at some pictures of our two-family homes in a minute and see how that works or doesn't work. So those are the reasons I think this is a type of housing that we should really consider keeping here. Lynn, next slide. All right, so that was like the day before Election Day. Lynn and Ben and I went around and walked most of the B residence zone and apartment zones in New Canaan to look at a lot of things. We looked at the areas where some of our zoning districts come together and there's potential conflicts, but we also were looking at the variety of single family homes and two-family homes being built. And so here I've put them together, not necessarily by geography, but by the age of the housing, because I felt like this actually told a more interesting story. And so these are some houses that we found that I checked these all with the assessor's data. That's how I came up with the era they were built. But these are all from the late 1800s, early 1900s. You can see the one on the left is on Seminary Street. The two on the right are on Strawberry Hill, I believe. The one on Seminary Street, I think was probably built as a two-family home, although I don't think the structure itself, well, you can tell that it's a two-family home size and scale-wise. It doesn't necessarily feel out of place with single-family homes. The two on the right, I'm not really sure what they were built as, but I think they were probably adapted over time to accommodate more than one dwelling unit. Next slide. Then we had these two, and I'm sure there's more like them. I actually wouldn't have known what era to put these in, but checking the assessor's data, these were from the 50s and 60s. I felt like they were kind of nondescript and a little bit ageless, and yet I was surprised to see how long they've been around. Lynn, next slide. Then we get into at least what I thought of when I think of two-family dwellings in New Canaan, which was there clearly was some sort of boom in two-family dwellings in the 1970s, and you see these all over town. On Lower Parade Hill, over by Rural Drive, all along River Street, at the end of Vitti and Cross Streets. You've got these two-family duplexes basically built in the 1970s. Next slide. There appears to have been another boom around the late 1990s, early 2000s. Quite a few of these are on Forest Street. And actually one is on, I think it's called Riverbank Court over off of Parade Hill. What I noticed about these is that you're seeing the style of home start to get bigger, specifically the two on the right side that are on Forest Street. They're bigger. They almost look like people desired the size of a single family home in the neighborhood closer to town. So you kind of smush two houses together into a bigger units on a smaller site. Also, you see the garages being pulled towards the front of the units. which seems to be a style that happened around that era.
It's called snout houses, as I remember.
Yes, that's what I learned in grad
Some
school.
places ban them where it's
Right.
mostly the frontage of the garage.
Right. Next slide, Lynn. Then, so post 2010, we have some things to show here too. This is on Main Street. I'd actually forgotten when I was taking the pictures that in my time on the commission, we also approved a two-family home on East Avenue that backs up to the construction on Cross and Beatty, which would also be a good example of attached two-family dwellings to put here. I just forgot to go and take a picture of that one. Next slide, Lynn.
I remember approving that specific one on Main Street way back in the day.
Oh, you do? Okay. That was before my time. And then these, I'm sure, are familiar to all of you. This, it appears to be post 2010 that we started approving, and I could be wrong. You all may know more about this than I do, but just looking at the dates on when the stuff was constructed, when we started allowing two detached single family homes on the same lot. And that is something that's fairly unique to New Canaan. And if we go to the next slide, I'll talk about that. All right, so in my background in planning, a two-family dwelling was always called a duplex. And a duplex is not always a two-family dwelling, is what I realized. A duplex is what we would call in New Canaan an attached two-family dwelling because there's a shared wall. Detached two-family dwellings, like the ones I just showed you on the last slide, where you have two homes on one lot, are pretty rare, not just here in New Canaan, but also around the country. I think historically they probably existed by either nonconformity or variance, but some places like Denver, Seattle, and Orlando actually still allow the construction of this type of housing. They call them tandem housing. And oftentimes it's provided on what they call a through lot, which is a lot that has frontage on two different streets, not necessarily a corner lot, but the opposite sides of the rectangle each face a different street. So examples of through lots in New Canaan would be like St. John's Place, houses that front there back up to Seminary Street. And so on a through lot, you could have theoretically two single family homes, each facing in opposite direction, opposite street frontage on the same lot. That's not how we do it here, but I'm just saying that that's how other places do it. Next slide. Okay, so I'm going to go through this slide and then pause for discussion. And then the following slide is some of my recommendations about what I think we should do. And I want to have conversations about that too. But these are some of the issues that I see with our development of two-family dwellings in town. The first is that we allow them in the B residence zone and apartment zone, which are our sort of residential core of our town, but also that's also the historic core of our town, obviously. I mean, that's where things developed first. And so you have these duplexes or two-family homes being built side by side with smaller scale, more historic single family homes. And I'm not saying that's inherently a conflict, but I think that creates a potential for a conflict. Add in that, as far as I can tell from the photos and just our walking, the scale has changed over time from, you know, what you saw in the late 1800s, even through the 1950s and 1970s, to what you're seeing post 2000, which can be bigger units being put on these lots. As we saw in the around the year 2000 photos, the garages moved up front. That may have just been a moment in town, the snout house moment in time. I don't see that in the things being built more recently. Maybe they just don't have the square footage, or maybe that's an aesthetic that's disappeared. And then the main issue, or the biggest issue I think I see, is these two single family dwellings on one lot. And again, like I said, in my time on the commission, I feel like there's kind of a push for this. And yet, Lynn, if you could scroll back, Lynn, can you scroll back to the pictures of those right there? You know, I think there's some issues with this. Number one, I feel like the scale of these houses, they're pretty big square footage wise, and it's not necessarily the building envelope on the lot, but it's the fact that, you know, some of them have a finished basement, a first floor, a second floor, and a fully finished attic. It feels big. add in that they're spaced very closely together. And, I think that's something at the discretion of the commission. If I remember the regulations properly, we decide how closely they're spaced. But frankly, in order to fit a house of that size on a lot of this size, you're going to have them close together. And I mean, in my opinion, that kind of breaks up the rhythm. I'm thinking of a street like Richmond Hill, where you've got single family home with the appropriate setbacks, single family home with the appropriate setbacks, and all of a sudden you've got two houses that feel really close together. And it just, the pattern and the rhythm of that streetscape, I think is disrupted by having these houses that close together. And then throw in the issue of impervious surface. When you're putting that much building on a small lot, and then you also have to accommodate parking and driveways, you're not really leaving any space for yards, which would help them feel probably a little more consistent with the single family houses around. I mean, certainly some of these have done some nice landscaping, but I think there's a lot of coverage beyond just the building on these lots. So Lynn, can you scroll down? I think that was my list of issues. And anyway, I'm curious now, just for sake of conversation, what you guys think about this, either the attached, the detached, or anything else we've talked about.
Yeah, this is John Kriz. The more I look at the detached single family, like the 4 that are right by the Richmond Hill parking lot, the less I like them. They really just seem so shoved together, and I just don't see it as a particularly attractive development. I think some of the, I'm going to call it zero lot line product, where they do share a wall in some way, like a semi. I would consider a duplex really an over and under, more stacked product. That's me. But for example, the one we approved, it was on East Maple, right by where the old Cleaners was, just the other side of Main Street from the library. It's right on, and it's one like this. And I think it looks really rather nice. And right across the street is another one. It's right by where the former gas station is, and it's now a car fix-it shop where you get your emissions checked. I think it looks rather nice too. And I think those types of dwellings are really much more consistent, and I think make better use of the space. Because I grant your point, Krista, that when you have separate buildings, you chew up a lot of the space just to give an area to walk between the buildings, and it becomes logistically awkward to sort of put those together with driveways and parking and all the rest. And I'm less enamored of those than a zero lot line type product with like a townhouse next to each other. Though the ones from the 60s, I think, are not the most attractive buildings we have in town. That's my view.
Anyone else?
I would agree. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Gene.
Okay. I would agree with John on both points. One, I don't think the 60-70 product is the best looking buildings, and they're not the best buildings in town. But I really think jamming these buildings together, it just does disturb the rhythm of the street. I don't think there's any question about it.
Okay.
This is Dan. I as well agree with that. And the example, even though it's not in the apartment or residence zone, but the example that I'd like to use is the application that was before us about 3 years ago, which was the Roger Sherman Inn. So prime example of a larger lot area. That's the 1 acre zone. You've got the Maples Inn next door that was renovated into multifamily housing. The inn itself, the garage in the back, it wasn't a series of cluster homes, but rather it was maintained as the large inn with the outbuildings, all of which are multiple dwelling units within it. And then the applicant came before us for the Roger Sherman Inn, who was going to tear it down. And at first, I think it was 8 or 10 units, and then it got down to, I think, 6 units. But it was essentially going to be similar to what we've got on Park Street over by the Richmond Hill lot, the 4 units, right? It was cluster homes right on top of each other. Granted, a different builder, probably a higher level of aesthetic, but it completely would have transformed the fabric of that part of town in a negative way, and we rejected it for that reason. And the same would apply in the, you know, the B residents in the apartment zones. I think when you're trying to jam all these units in there just for the sake of being able to sell someone their own quote unquote house, rather than a, you know, a condo or an apartment that's attached and has a shared wall, it detracts from the overall aesthetic. I think you're better off doing connected buildings that can then allow a little more flexibility in terms of the architecture. I think we have to be careful about the density and the coverage and the FAR ratios for those type of lots, all of which we kind of address already in the zoning code. But you know, it all depends. I think, for example, the 2 units that are on Richmond Hill that are further down on Richmond Hill, they abut the empty lot on Richmond Hill, kind of overlooking the pond.
Mm-hmm.
Those are just 2 units on what would probably be, I think that lot is 0.3 of an acre. And it's a front and rear unit. It looks okay. It's better than the Park Street one, which I think it's just because it's so exposed and visible from 2 sides. It's kind of obvious that you're stacking houses on top of each other. You know, I would have rather seen something like the brick. I think they're brick condos that are up against Mead Pond, that are directly across the street on Richmond Hill from those 2 units. You know, they're the brick condos. There's about, I think, 5 or 6 of them that look over the pond. Those are really well done.
Mm-hmm.
They're probably about similar square footage and probably equal level of fit and finish as those others across the street, and they're connected, but they're designed in such a way where they're articulated and they look like they're their own element, and they work.
Yeah, I agree. I actually, until I walked with Lynn and Ben, I was not aware. I'd never noticed that was 2 separate units there on the base of Richmond Hill. I had always just thought it was one house because that's all you really see from the front, especially when you're driving, which is usually how I'm going up Richmond Hill.
I would also suggest, this is John Chris, that the snout houses do not look nice.
Yeah, Dan, do you have any thought, like, is that just a relic of the past, or are people still building those? I haven't seen so many lately.
The snout houses?
Yeah.
No, I think it is a relic of the past. Just the proportions are just so powerful and presence to the street, and I think people are trying to, you know, trying to do it in such a way where you have less of a garage presence on the street. It all depends on the site, you know, what kind of flexibility and size of lot you have. Sometimes you're forced into that kind of a condition because you don't have the width of the lot to address garages from the side.
Mm-hmm.
It all depends on the site.
Okay.
You know, the example, the better example for that is the Main Street house that you had, the one I mentioned that we approved way back when.
Mm-hmm.
Those have garages in the back,
Mm-hmm.
and you're able to drive around the side of the house and access the garage from the back. So it was, you know, designed differently and probably a slightly different lot configuration, had more depth to it, that they were able to do that.
Mm-hmm.
It's John Chris again. I would suggest that stacked product, we have, let's say, a dwelling on one level, and then above it is a separate dwelling on another level, is a much different type of habitation than ones where you have essentially a building next to a building that share a common wall. And if you get into 3 and 4 unit buildings, again, it's a much different sort of situation as regards height and density and so forth. And we may want to think about them somewhat differently than essentially a standalone semi-detached house. Because some of these houses are really pretty big. They're bigger than my house, frankly. And I know the 4 that are on Richmond Hill, all of the elevators in them, as I remember.
Right.
And a lot of these new ones, which are designed often for aging in place, you know, empty nesters who are, you know, in their 50s and want to downscale and want to live in the unit indefinitely. Again, they tend to have elevators. So these are, fairly high-priced dwellings, has been my experience.
Yeah, this is Art. As you guys know, I invest in affordable and senior housing for a living. Three things jump at me. Number one, you will find that with respect to senior, because all seniors do want cars, driveway access and the quote snout houses are still being built throughout New England because seniors want easy access to the vehicle and they do not want the incremental cost of building an elevator. So one of the things that is quite common in this space is that people want to be able to get in a car. We can talk a lot about, walking accessibility, but an awful lot of people never walk anywhere. It goes
So
back,
true.
True.
yeah, and it gets back to to our plan objective, right? I mean, are we trying to add units for seniors? Or are we trying to add units that are affordable for seniors? Or are we trying to add affordable units? The communities around us have all moved to inclusionary zoning for all new permits as their way of dealing with lower income and in many cases senior housing. Many seniors, of course, become income eligible for what is low income housing as soon as they retire. And so another way to grapple with this is that every time we grant a permit for a 20-unit building, as Stamford and Norwalk and other towns are doing, you say, hey, 10% of your units have to be affordable under the actual affordable statutes. That goes a long way to avoiding people trying to cram units like these in that don't add a lot of units to the housing stock, but do a lot of damage to adjacent property values.
Good points.
This is Claire.
Okay.
This weekend in the Wall Street Journal, they had a section about housing that has kind of like a studio attached to it. So it'd be a single family home and then they'd have a separate studio, usually for a senior, a parent who, has moved back in with them. And I think that's kind of like a hybrid between senior housing and what we're talking about here. But it's something that I think people may be open to and may be responsive to. We may want to add some type of regulation to our zoning regs about that type of housing, like a type of hybrid, single family with adjacent or attached, studio apartment, if you will.
So would that be different than accessory dwelling units? Because that's
Well, they're
kind of what it sounds
attached.
like.
It's built as one building. It's built as one
okay.
unit. I'll send you the article.
The unit is inside the one building. It's not.
And from the street, it looks like a single family home.
Right.
There might be like a wing in the back, and that is the living area, bedroom, all one floor for the senior.
Okay.
And to consider those units accessory housing units, though.
Yeah. We used to have there was the idea of granny pods. I remember they were called granny pods anyway, that we ruled on, was about a year or two ago.
Mm-hmm. Claire, yeah.
An accessory unit, a legal accessory unit, you really can't age restrict it, as I understand it. So, it essentially becomes a rental unit. You may rent it to a relative de facto, but it's a rental unit. You can do with it as you will. It's a legal unit.
Yeah, FHA regulations make it almost impossible once a unit is actually granted to actually do anything by age, sex, gender, or anything else, including family membership. So the real problem with the creation of these accessory units, and as somebody who's been involved in a whole bunch of FHA actions, the key is to actually, if you're an owner, is to just get a permit and then lease it to your son, your daughter, your third cousin, because there's nothing you can do about it once it exists, as long as it's legally granted. And I think at our July meeting, we raised some of these concepts, but the standard permit is always, I want to have someplace for mom-in-law or mom to go. But once the unit exists, particularly if it has a refrigerator and water, there's nothing you can do about it. And there is virtually nothing that you can do to enforce rental restrictions.
Anything else on issues with two-family homes before we move ahead towards some recommendations?
What about setbacks and so forth?
Yeah,
Because many of these tend to be rather large buildings, and I don't get the sense that of the ones that have been built recently, that the people are looking for any kind of yard maintenance. The ones that do exist are pretty much postage stamp, or it's permanent plantings. They're pretty small, and there may be a little patio somewhere where you put the propane grill, but that's about as far as it goes, and those tend to be on the small side too. But I remember when we had that application that was withdrawn on Richmond Hill, right across from the park, where they wanted to tear down the two older houses and put up, I think it was 4. They wanted to have setbacks changed to almost nothing, if memory serves. And so, the setback issue may be something we look at, because if I reflect on our conversation regarding the 2 detached houses, again, it chews up a lot of real estate, literally, and setbacks become probably an issue there. I remember that being an issue, where you're kind of building up to the lot line. So we may want to take a fresh look at what setbacks may be appropriate.
then refresh my memory for a second. Do we have, I mean, I'm looking at the zoning code, but I don't have that big chart you have in your office. Do we have different setback requirements for two-family homes in the B residence zone as opposed to single-family homes?
Do.
Okay.
So if you're in the B residence, we have 3 different determinations. Oh, sorry, you're gonna hear an echo. There's a setback for if you're one family with an accessory. Maybe that's better.
Yeah, that's fine.
And there's also a 2-family, and you have to have a minimum lot area. So if you were a 1 family, you can have a minimum lot area of 7,500 square feet. If you were 1 family with an accessory, it's 9,000 square feet. And the accessory in the B zone is typically, with 9,000 square feet, it's typically attached to by a common wall to the house, the principal structure. And for a 2-family, you need 12,000 square feet. And then everyone has a front yard setback for all 3 of those at 25 feet. But if you are a 1 family, your side yard setbacks would be 8 feet. If you're a 1 family with an accessory, your side yard setbacks are 12. And if you're a 2 family, your side yard setbacks are 15. And then we have the side yard height requirement, because that's the zone where we worry about the height. But the dimensional setbacks do differ based on your actual use and the size of your lot in the B zone.
Okay. But I agree, John. I think we might want to just, take a look at those again. All right, for the sake of time, I'm going to move along to some of my recommendations, and then, I want to have a conversation about that and what you guys like and what you don't like and what you would add.
I'll go back and share the screen, Krista.
Yeah, thank you.
No problem.
So I realized after I turned this into Lynn that I would probably have put these in a different order, so I'm going to jump around a little bit. But my first recommendation is that I think we should remove the allowing detached two-family dwellings in the B residential zone and the apartment zone, leaving for now only what we call attached two-family dwellings or duplexes in those zones. I'm not necessarily convinced that having multiple homes on one lot is a bad idea. I just think the way that it's happening right now in the B residential zone and the apartment zone is not ideal. And I'm not sure, I'm convinced that we can amend those districts to make that work. So in place of doing detached two-family dwellings in those zones, I would jump down to number 5, which is where I say we should consider developing zoning standards for cluster housing. This goes by a lot of different names, whether you want to call it, we talked about it, I think at the July meeting, as pocket neighborhoods, bungalow courts, cottage communities. But essentially what it is smaller detached dwelling units on a single lot, more than one on a single lot. And, I don't know where we would land on that, if that's something we want to do or not, but I think that it's something we should at least consider if we are going to get rid of allowing it under the B residence zone. And, and then we need to figure out where that would fit, whether it's under one of our existing districts or be more appropriate as its own district. So that's 1 and 5. Now I'm going to skip to 3 because, like I said, I didn't do a good job putting these in order. I think that one thing that could really help, so I've been going back and forth in my head for months now as I look at our zoning map and the areas where some of our districts come together, Seminary Street being a prime example, but also Richmond Hill, where you have the B zone, the apartment zone, maybe the A residential zone, kind of all butting up against each other, and knowing that you can get different styles of development on those lots along one street frontage. So I've thought about, should we change the zoning? But one thing that Lynn and I talked about on our walk that I think could be a great solution without having to do the heavy lifting of changing zoning districts is creating what I'd call residential infill design guidelines for both single family and 2-family homes. I listed the districts that I thought here, but again, this is open for conversation. I listed the apartment zone, the A residential zone, the B residential zone, the 1/3 acre and the 1/2 acre zones, which would really get you just a little bit beyond that core, our residential core that I showed on the map earlier in the presentation. Because primarily what you're going to see in any of those areas on that map is infill residential development. I mean, we're pretty much built out. I don't know if we even have any vacant lots available, but if we do, it's pretty much going to be infill. And so I think probably through design guidelines, we could effectuate the type of consistency, both in terms of scale and design, that would help them fit into the existing housing stock that's there. And related to that is number 4. I think that we should take a hard look at how we control the scale of new residential infill development. There's a lot of options out there, and I don't profess to be an expert in any of them, but whether it's maximum square footage, floor area ratios, building coverage, maximum amounts of impervious surface, there's a lot of ways to get at that. And I think that could or should be part of the design guidelines and/or changes we make to the base zoning districts. And then the last thing I recommend is number 2, which is to consider whether we want to encourage triplexes or quadruplexes, so 3 or 4 unit buildings, either in the B residential zone or in some other zone. And the reason I thought about this is, at least in the planning world, and actually in the whole desegregate Connecticut conversation that's going on in our state right now, there's this conversation about what they call the missing middle housing, which is housing stock that helps you step up from single family to multifamily, but it can still be, it can transition from either of those types of neighborhoods. And so missing middle housing is essentially 2, 3, and 4 family units. In our zoning ordinance right now, anything 3 units and above is considered multifamily. And so anyway, my question, I guess, to the group is, and or my recommendation is that we might want to consider pulling 3 and 4 family out of the multifamily designation and see if there's interest in including those in town the way that we allow 2-family dwellings to exist right now. Because I think if they're designed properly, the scale of those can fit in well with single family neighborhoods and yet allow us to increase density in a way that I think ultimately we're going to have to accommodate the future. So those are my ideas. Thoughts on that or other ideas?
How are you defining duplexes versus attached 2-family?
So in my mind, they're one and the same. It's the same word, just, same meaning. I know in your mind it was different because of the up-down versus side-by-side issue, and I hadn't considered that.
I would just suggest that you need a precise definition for these. Because otherwise it gets litigated or people read it differently. So if you say or, I mean, it indicates that a duplex is something different from an attached 2-family. When you say attached, you can attach a lot of ways. You can do an over and under, a side by side. we may not care, or we may care, but again, that's something that we may want to be precise about. As far as triplexes and quadruplexes, I'm still of the, it's more of an apartment type of unit than it is a B residence zone type of unit, particularly given the likely size of those. And so my view is I'd probably want to keep them more in the apartment zone than the B residence zone. Having design guidelines, I think, is a good idea, which includes issues of floor area ratio and size and so forth, impervious surface. I think cluster housing, everyone wanted to define it as a much bigger issue, including where you're going to put it.
Yeah.
There are not a lot of places to put it, unless you're going to allow it in a 4-acre zone or somewhere where you get a lot of real estate to deal with. But to try to put something like that on a 1-acre odd lot that's somewhere in the B residence zone is going to be tricky, I would think. Logistically, just trying to figure out how to put it someplace.
Yeah, I mean, I will say in the concept of cluster housing, and I will completely admit that the examples I've looked at are in much more urban situations than New Canaan, Portland, Oregon being one that I look to a lot, but it is surprising. I would say, oh, we have pretty small lots in the B residence zone, so how could we possibly fit more than one unit? I mean, they're fitting multiple units of detached homes on 2,500 square foot lots. So I mean, it may not be appropriate for us. I completely agree with that, but people are figuring out how to do it on lots much smaller than the ones we have in New Canaan. And again, it's a more urban setting, so like I said, may not be appropriate, but it's definitely possible.
There
Well,
would
yeah,
be a lot of coverage.
What's that?
There would be a lot of coverage and a lot of impervious surface.
Yeah, I mean, the cluster housing concept really is intended to have that common green in the middle. Again, I don't profess to know how they're fitting all of that on a tiny, tiny lot, but I guess what they're probably doing, they're probably not including parking because it's more of an urban area, so people park on street.
no, the way
Yeah.
they do it is actually quite simple. What you do is you say, I'm going to apply 830G, which overrides local zoning. So having been on both sides of this, we should be really prepared for this, right? And we saw this happen with the building the Merit Apartments, right? As soon as there was some discussion about not allowing it, then the developer says, well, you know what, I'm going to override your local zoning and I'm going to put as many units in as I want. And invariably, though it has never actually happened in the state of Connecticut, the local zoning boards say, okay, you know what, we'll let you go with your higher density. So what you end up with is a very simple equation. And in fact, people say, well, you know what, I really want to put these units downtown. They're walkable. The state's transit-oriented development, TOD rules, and the funding from DOH and DECD support that. So all you need to do is open the door a tad and say, okay, we're going to allow multiple units, and somebody will come in and they'll say, okay, sure. I don't think it's dense enough, and you want to do something to meet sort of a broader array of alternatives, and I can apply 830G. And then everything that we've done, including setbacks, is overruled. And it's a pernicious approach, but that's how you get this occurring.
I have some questions about that though, because number one, I could be totally wrong and you know more about this than I do, but wouldn't you want, if you're going to apply 830G and do affordable housing, wouldn't there be some basic number of units you would want to apply to make that, 3, 4, 5 units, is that going to be worth your effort for 830G?
So what happens with 830G is if you are building affordable housing and you get a tax credit award and you're the general partner, you can actually build an enormous housing complex with none of your own money, because you can get equity via the application of state and federal housing tax credits. So what that says to you, and there are very constrained, very specific requirements, both for eligibility of income and size of unit. And all it does is it creates a stock development of housing, which is built in a very straightforward pattern. But what it does is it allows you to override local zoning. So if you get valuable land from somewhere, right, then what you'll end up with is someone saying, okay, yeah, you got these rules, but I can go downtown and do this. And I actually like all of the recommendations you've made, except with respect to encouraging 3 or 4s, because what happens with 3 and 4s is somebody says, okay, I could take the attic and I can turn another unit in an existing apartment, right? And usually who rents that is somebody who wants to get into town, who can't quite afford the price point. And I'm not sure if that really is going to serve your objective. Remembering, and my favorite example of this when I spoke at the Merritt Apartments approval thing years ago, was they were talking about the apartments being more affordable, but in reality, they were not creating a single unit of affordable housing under the rules. They actually created 120 new units, which meant the net increase in the number of units we had to have was another 12. And so, if you really want to be thoughtful about 830G and about actually creating a more diversified housing stock, we have to build stuff that will actually serve those needs, not serve wealthy kids coming back from the city or whatever it is. I mean, I remember, and I've lived in town for 32 years, right? Really scary. But I remember when I moved here, right? Everybody said, oh, there are no additional lots to build anything on. And as soon as prices started to rise, lots popped out of nowhere. And if you read the advertiser year after year after year, developers are really clever at figuring that out. The real problem with affordable housing is that you can build it with absolutely no equity if you are a developer.
Look what happened in Wilton.
Yeah.
When they lost the 830G.
Yeah.
There are a lot of developments, and it's what passes for affordable is still pretty expensive.
Yeah.
There.
And yet, am I wrong in thinking that that can happen with or without the recommendations I put on the table? I mean,
no, it absolutely can, but it gets back to a fundamental question. If we're trying to build more units, right?
Right.
And one of our things is to cause ourselves to be prepared for the pressure that we expect to see on diversity and youth and seniors and everything else. You want to build units that are not, okay, as an example, those snout houses that we were looking at earlier today, my suspicion is those cost, say, $700,000 or $800,000. That won't serve our objective,
right,
relative to satisfying income equality, racial diversity, and senior access, right? Because honest to God, if you live in town and you own a house and you've been here for a while and you start to do the math, you're much better off staying wherever you are and paying your property taxes and your maintenance fees than trying to buy one of these, $800,000 to $1 million units that have carrying costs and condo fees that are much more than you pay.
right. Okay, we only have a couple more minutes. Are there other thoughts or questions for consideration?
You mentioned, Krista, about the where the lines are drawn between the various zoning areas, and I remember as a comment some time ago, I think it was from Jean, that things develop over time since we last reviewed these, as far as what buildings went where and traffic patterns and so forth. And so it might be useful to take a fresh look of exactly what cards have been dealt in our town as far as what is where, and look at whether there may be some tweaking in some of these where the lines are drawn, so that there are, there's a split where the state road is going or something else, rather than sort of where it was 30 years ago. So I don't think a wholesale review is necessary, but I think moving them slightly one way or another might be useful, just to see whether they sort of make sense given where sidewalks now are and where people are driving and what other buildings have been built over the years. So.
Yep, I do have a short list, and I'm sure at some point we'll talk about that. Anything else?
Thank you, Krista. That was a great job.
Thanks, Jean.
A lot for thought here.
Lynn, did you have minutes we need to approve from a prior meeting? I saw it on the agenda. That's the only reason I'm asking.
Yeah,
I have not seen
there were minutes, and I don't think I have a copy of them. But yeah, they were from the
We
July
just
meeting.
approve them at the next meeting?
Yes.
Okay.
We can.
All right, well, that was a lot of good feedback. I will circle back with Lynn. Lynn, was there anything that you wanted me to mention or that you thought to mention that I did not?
No, I think you covered everything. The only thing I would mention is that we do have some level of, in, I guess, affordable housing. We collect an affordable housing fund on all zoning permits when you go to build new construction or additions. So it's a fee that is paid by everyone who has to take out a zoning permit. So every time you build a new house, it goes into a percentage comes out and you pay it as part of your building permit fee. And we collect it and put it into a fund that is for affordable housing. Any developer in town could apply to use it. The only one that has is Canaan Parish typically. It's section 7.6. It's a really short section, but and I think we're like one of the only municipalities in the state that has that collects that fee.
There are actually similar buckets in Greenwich and Westport,
Okay.
but ours is bigger relative to the town, and it's been much more effectively used, particularly in the Canaan Parish redevelopment.
Yeah, I mean, with the Desegregate Connecticut movement, I've received a lot of requests from planners around the state asking how that was put in and for copies of that section or links to that section on our website. So it's been pretty popular. New Canaan was a forerunner in that one.
I will add, just for our subcommittee, before we get into public space, that several of the developers who, even in my short time on this committee, I'm actually an investor in their affordable housing that they do elsewhere in the state. So they are well aware of, and I'm the investor in all four affordable, my bank is, in all four of the affordable projects in town. And so people are actively, I've seen proposals through them for New Canaan that are sort of sitting in the back of their bins. And they're also quite aware of the trust fund.
That's interesting.
Lynn,
So-
what was it we were supposed to do for channel, or we supposed
So
to?
I'm gonna, well, that's what I have to turn off the recording and then I'm gonna open the waiting room and then I'm gonna restart the recording. So
We don't have to log back in, right? We can just
you can stay, but I'm gonna let everyone else who's in the waiting room in.
Okay, so Krista, your meeting's adjourned?
Yes, my meeting's adjourned. Thank you.
Okay, let's
Okay.
take about 3 or 4 minutes.